Okay, so Ruth, you're on.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So we've got our recording set. Yes, I see that. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Summer Sunday conversation that we're going to have with Debbie-Ann Paige. And Debbie is going to be available to take your questions after she and I finish our discussion/conversation. So let me introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Debbie-Ann Paige. Debbie-Ann, as most of you know, is a public historian, and she's also senior policy analyst with the Council of State Governments. And I just want to give a little shout out to Debbie and her wonderful connection to the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. She has been a great friend to our church. And you know, yesterday when we were sort of preparing our talk, I had said to her, oh gosh, you know, I think that somehow when we started doing book readings with you facilitating, it was maybe that led to us hanging our Black Lives Matter banner outside the church. And she said to me, oh, no. I saw your Black Lives Matter banner, and that's when I joined the conversations and the book discussions, which really delighted me. And I just want to mention a couple of the books that we did read with Debbie facilitating the conversations and discussions afterwards. We had read I Can't Breathe, A Killing on Bay Street by Matt Taibbi. I can never say his name, Taibbi. Citizen by Claudia Rankin. And last year before, we took almost a year to discuss Ibram X. Kendi's amazing book, Stamped from the Beginning, which of course is his definitive view of the idea of race in America. Debbie divided that up into sections, and we would read for a month or so, and then we'd come back and talk, and then we'd do another section, a couple of months, read and talk. And that was the most wonderful experience, and we learned so much. So in that being said, background to how we all got involved here, in preparation for today's talk, Debbie and I discussed three, what I call seminal moments. And those times in American history that struck me when seeds for significant progress in defeating the embedded racism that divides us at every class level were planted, and that might have taken us in a very different direction, but didn't. And why? Why did that happen? Or why didn't that happen? So the first moment that we looked at, the three moments that we're looking at are radical Reconstruction, the Great Migration, and the Kerner Commission report of 1968. And those were the three we settled on. So I'm just going to take a couple of moments to set up the background on each of these times, and then I'm going to turn it over to Debbie to tell us a little bit more about it. So our first moment was radical Reconstruction, also known as, which is actually known as Congressional Reconstruction. And that runs from the period from 1869 to 1877. By 1869, the Republican Party was in firm control of all three branches of the federal government. Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, had been impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. So his power to obstruct the small bit of Reconstruction that Lincoln had begun was now overturned. He was no longer able to do that. Republican Ulysses S. Grant was elected president in the fall. At that time, 16 African Americans served in Congress during the Congressional Reconstruction. More than 600 served in state legislatures, and hundreds of more served in local offices scattered across the South. The Black political leadership pressed for elimination of the racial caste system. They looked to lift the economic situation for the formerly enslaved. They established the South's first state-funded public school system. They sought to strengthen the bargaining power for plantation laborers, who were, of course, formerly enslaved. They made taxation more equitable, and they outlawed racial discrimination in public transportation and accommodations. In addition, Congress approved the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from restricting the right to vote because of race. In 1871, the administration launched legal and military offensive that destroyed the Ku Klux Klan. Grant was reelected in 1872 in the most peaceful election of the period. So what could go wrong? And yet, by the 1890s, Reconstruction had been painted as a corrupt era of Negro rule. So Debbie, the question, in your view on this period of robust Reconstruction, a fair and equal Reconstruction that offered the formerly enslaved the opportunity to participate in full democracy as citizens, why didn't it succeed?
Let me think. Race. I think that there's a lot going on, a lot of different touch points that are going on during this time. So we're looking at the South as this anomaly of where racism is germane, and it's horrible and it's horrific, and that you have a lot of you have the formerly enslaved who are now pushing for their rights, and they're trying to reclaim them. But one of the things that we don't do, I think, or we don't do well, is to juxtapose North and South. That as they're creating laws and as they're struggling through this time of Renaissance, for lack of a better way of saying it, the North, places like Staten Island, are struggling as well, right? So the same racism, the same racist ideas, the same racist thoughts and movements are happening here on Staten Island as they are happening in the South. And so those who identify as white during that time, many of them, even the radical Republicans, George Curtis, Francis Shaw, Sidney Howard Gay, didn't quite believe in equality. They believed in this notion of ending slavery because they believed slavery was wrong. But Frank Shaw, as a free soiler, kind of bought into this notion of free soilers believed that they wanted any lands that were developed past the Ohio to be free of slavery, not necessarily because it was bad for people of African descent, but because they felt that slavery was corrupting white people, more specifically white men, because they had access to Black women's bodies. And a part of this Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening, they wanted, they wanted to free themselves of slavery. So if you have this mindset that it's not necessarily about equality, then as you're moving through Reconstruction, it becomes difficult to parse out where I fall short of understanding equality between amongst everybody, and this notion of trying to make things work. And if you don't have, or they didn't have, a good foundation, then how did we really expect them to make it work?
Okay. All right. And any other thoughts on that, or we'll go on?
Listen, I got a lot of thoughts on it.
Okay.
So here in Stapleton, right? So
Yeah.
Stapleton is one of those places that I use as an example of a lot of things. And so in Stapleton, right after the war, during the 1880s, and so it's a little bit after this Reconstruction period, but before you get to the Great Migration, you have children of African descent attending a segregated colored school in Stapleton. And you had these students at one point decided that they were no longer going, they had an African-American principal, and he got sick and he had to leave the school, and the school board, which consisted of 3 white men, put in a young white woman as a teacher, and the students were like, no, we're going to boycott. We have this moment where we are going to take agency, and in taking agency, they boycotted the school from, I believe it was April until October, until they actually put in a young African-American teacher. She became the principal of the school. And they then, so you have these opposing forces that's right here amongst us, where the school board provides her, they give her a contract, and they say, here, Clara, her name was Clara Tobias. They said, here, Clara, we're gonna ask you to sign this contract to work for this next year. And then 2 of the 3 school board members get together and they decide that they're going to pull her contract, and she has to sue them. And it's such a big deal that the New York Times is now covering it. And they're saying, you know, here we go again with Staten Island. Here we go again with trying to figure out, you know, what are they doing there in Staten Island, that the students are boycotted, and white people aren't good enough for Black students in Stapleton. But they missed the idea of agency.
Right.
They missed the idea that while the South is struggling, we here in the North are struggling as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Debbie. That's great. So our next moment is the Great Migration, and the Great Migration extends from 1915 to 1970, which is quite a long time. So according to Isabel Wilkerson in her book about the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns, wonderful book, by the way, it was World War I that touched off the mass migration of Black people from the South to the industrial centers in the North, the Midwest, and eventually out west as well, to the West as well. The people had been fleeing the South. Blacks had been trying to escape from the South with limited success since the inception of slavery in 1619. And of course, we know hundreds found a route north via the Underground Railroad, which we're very familiar with here. During the first decade of the 20th century, some 194,000 Blacks left coastal and border towns in the South, of course, fleeing Jim Crow laws. And they found home in places like Harlem or in North Philadelphia. But it was the labor crisis of World War I that opened the floodgates. The war had cut off the supply of immigrant labor, so those workers were not available for industry in the North. Immigration had fallen by 90% at that time, when the country needed all the help it could get for the war effort. Some 555,000 Blacks left the South during the decade of the First World War, more than all the formerly enslaved who had fled in the 5 decades after the Emancipation Proclamation. Northern industry, steel mills, railroads, packing houses, all looked to the South for the poorest paid labor, as always. When Black people were courted by labor recruiters from the North, they began to leave the South in massive numbers because they had the promise of something to go to, work, decent lives, and so they left. The migration was supposed to stop by the end of the war, but the hardened institution of Jim Crow made the Great Migration very different from ordinary human migrations. It was more like the vast movements of refugees from famine or war or genocide in other parts of the world. And it spread across the North, through the Midwest, and to the West. So again, Debbie, for you, my question is, so what did these migrants expect to find when they came, hopefully arriving in the North? And then what was the reality? In what way were refugees from the South integrated into the life and the work in Northern communities, or not? And I think here you really can address kind of what we saw here on Staten Island.
So I think that many had a lot of hope that the North, you know, there's always the streets paved with gold for whatever group is leaving difficult situations, excuse me. And many felt that they would find, they would at least get a fair shake, you know, once they made it north, and they could manage on their own, you know, the sweat of their own brow for themselves. But when they got to the north, they found that race was still a barrier here, as it was in the South. People tend to have this notion of discussing this time period with income, right? And equality in income and the ability to move up, upward mobility. But income is not the problem. Income tends to not be the problem. Race is always permeated through everything. The fact that okay, let me give you an example. In 1908, there was a woman named Mrs. Dickinson. She was from Nashville, Tennessee, and she was touring different parts of the North. She went to Connecticut, she came to Staten Island, she was in Jersey, she was in quite a few places, because Nashville, I don't know if you know, had one of the worst race riots in 1866. Mm-hmm. Many people died. It was a horrific event. Tennessee is the birthplace of the Klan. And when, in this article, when Mrs. Dickinson comes to Staten Island, she talks about the fact that African Americans there aren't working. As a matter of fact, she uses the term, quote, "the Negro has no pension for work." And you go, what? What is she talking about? But then you read the next line that says, "because his help is not wanted." So while you have this great group of people who are migrating out of the South, a lot of the Staten Islanders who come from places like Virginia and North Carolina, because as the Great Migration is moving, it kind of moves across the country this way. So if you're in the South, you tend to go straight up. So if you're in North Carolina and Virginia, you're gonna come to the Eastern Coast. If you're in places like Alabama or Mississippi, you're gonna go to places like the Midwest. And if you're in places as far west as Texas and Louisiana, you're gonna find your way to the West Coast. And so the bulk of people move this way. But as they're moving out, this woman, who is one generation from the most horrific race riot in Tennessee, says that it is the worst place in terms of racism, and I wish I had the exact quote in front of me, but it is the worst place in terms of racism that she had ever seen. And that has to give you pause, that this woman whose family has come out of this horrific time right during Reconstruction, is now saying that Staten Island is probably the worst place for race that she has seen. And so that's what a lot of the people who came to Staten Island met and bucked up against. Thomas Dixon, who wrote The Klansman, that then becomes the film Birth of a Nation, is actually living on Staten Island during this time. And wow. So you have a lot of these different strings of different peoples from a lot of different places that that people of African descent meet when they get here. And a lot of them choose Staten Island because it still offered that rural feel of home, yet it was supposed to be different. Now, we talked a little bit about recruiting, you know, the nurse during this time. So it's a big, wide time frame. So during this time, you have people who are, the Black Angels are being recruited from, you know, from the South, and they're coming and they're working at Seaview, and they have to find a way to make it work for them. You've got people from,
Debbie, can I interrupt you here? Could you just say a little tiny bit more about the Black Angels, who they were, what they were doing, and why they were working in the particular places where they were working?
So basically the Black Angels were African-American nurses who were recruited from parts South, Atlantic City, Georgia, you know, Alabama, North Carolina, all the southern states, they were recruited to work at Seaview while they were trying to find a cure for the tuberculosis, because most of, or many of the white nurses refused to work. They had had enough. They were afraid, and they walked out. They walked away, and so they needed nurses. And as the story goes, that I know of it, one of the patients called one of the nurses his black angel. And because of the care, the love and care that they were receiving, and the nickname just kind of stuck, and that's who they became. And they settled a part of Staten Island called the Dog Patch, and they made that a thriving community. But throughout all of that, and threaded throughout that, now we're moving into the 1920s. Well, let me go back. Many of you have heard me talk about a 1906 near lynching in Tompkinsville. And now in 1908, you have Mrs. Dickinson talking about the racism. And then we move into the 1920s, where you have a whole new set of people who are coming in, and then you get the 1930s. And the 1930s are where we're trying to recover from the Great Depression. And we've got this New Deal. But the New Deal isn't necessarily made for people of African descent. Like you have the CCC with the oh gosh, the name is
the Civil Conservation Corps.
Thank you very much. You have the Civil Conservation Corps that is the young men from the South refuse to work with African Americans, and so they segregate it. And they give the choice jobs to the white young men, and African Americans have a difficult time working it. There's an article that I have that talks about it from the 1920s, that talks about the strife between labor and the ships and the shipping union, right? So those who work on the ships, where there was some kind of riot on the ship, and the African Americans banded together to protect the captain, and there's this strife. So we're constantly bucking up against this notion of we're all poor,
right?
We're supposed to figure out how to work together, but this barrier of race acts like a magnet. It keeps pushing us back away from each other.
Didn't people of color also have trouble joining unions? Were they not?
They couldn't join, and so they became scabs. Is that the term?
Yes, yeah.
And so they became, and that's how they were able to work oftentimes, especially with the ferry, right? With the Staten Island ferry. More often than not, when African Americans were able to work, it came about because of a strike, and they were strike busting. So they brought in African Americans who needed the jobs, and so they took them, and that created even more conflict.
Yep.
And then you have now, everyone is destitute because of the Depression, and we're all trying to find our way out of it. And they create all of these alphabet soup organizations. They have, the FHA is now giving out loans, and they're making home ownership the central basis for wealth to come out of this. But they then put in place these strict laws that prohibit the living together of African Americans and those who would identify as white in major dwellings. So if you have a community like Levittown that you're creating, you have to promise not to allow African Americans to purchase homes there. If you have buildings like projects going up, the federal government is saying that you cannot mix white and Black people together in these buildings. There's an article that talks about the creation of, they were struggling with creating the New Brighton projects. And the New Brighton projects, although they are now occupied mainly by people of African descent, were initially occupied by the Italians. And so I was going to share my screen with you just so we could see kind of what redlining looked like. And this is where the term redlining and that whole era comes into being. All right, let's share that. Okay, so this is the map of Staten Island. And I'm going to just point out these pieces. If you can see them highlighted in red.
Yeah, yes.
That is New Brighton. And how they've carved up New Brighton, they've gerrymandered New Brighton. And this is from I believe this is 1940. So they've gerrymandered New Brighton and they've created this carved out piece. And Jersey Street is where the majority of African Americans live. Let me see if I can come up with the, hold on 1 minute, I need to, hold on. Just so I can zoom in a little bit for you. Okay, oops, sorry. My mouse gets away from me a little bit. So this tells you who's living where here, and it talks about what's happening. And then the infiltration is the term that they use. The infiltration is Italian. Mm-hmm. And so in New Brighton, the majority of people who are living there, there's 75% of them that are foreign born. They're Jewish and Italian. But there are still 20% African American who live there. And within the gerrymandered red pieces is the majority of part where it's Brighton Avenue and it's Jersey Street. And so this is where African Americans are living in the 1940s. Wow. And then they do this write up and tell you about why it's depressed and why it's getting that way. There's another piece. Let me see if I can get to it. I believe it's here. Is this the one? Wait a minute. Hold on. My mouse is a little stuck. Okay. Let me see if I can zoom in for you. So this piece here is this is the sandy ground.
Oh, okay.
And you'll notice that in Staten Island, there's a lot of undeveloped, anything that's in white is undeveloped. And by 1940, the federal government has decided that the sandy ground is a depressed place. It is, it's undesirable and declining. I'm just trying to get now to the scan. And here's where it talks about there's been little or no activity in this small colored area and prices are only nominally different. The change from 39 to levels were $12 to $24, and it's sparse development. The toilets are outside, and they give it this really horrific write-up and in justifying why they have decided to redline it and why it's undesirable and they can't do anything. But if you redline it, you also can't take out an FHA loan to fix up your home. So they've stopped you on both sides. They've coming and going, so to speak.
Right.
But you'll also see that wherever in Staten Island, wherever they have decided that the immigrant population is living there, so we have places, oh, sorry about that. My mouse just always gets away with me. Come on people, let's do it. We can do this. It's usually why I do slides. But you can see here in Staten Island, I'll just try to do a couple of them there. And let me stop sharing. What happens is that along the Eastern Shore, you have a large immigrant population there as well. Italian, mostly Italian, some of them Irish. who are the undesirables, quote unquote. And so they've redlined those communities as well. And what happens to redline communities? They get more depressed. So if you think about what's happened during Hurricane Sandy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you had places like Midland Beach and Newport Beach and South Beach. And those places, what happens is that they purchased these homes in the 30s, some possibly earlier, and they just held on to them. And the wealth was transferred to generation to generation to generation. You then become house rich and cash poor. And so more often than not, some of them had allowed the insurance to lapse, or they didn't have the right coverage. And so they were unable to rebuild. But they did have that wealth to pass on because they were at least allowed to purchase those homes. And so if third generation, fourth generation decides that they want to sell, they still will walk away with a huge cash profit and have the ability to establish themselves somewhere else. That wasn't necessarily the case for African Americans here in Staten Island. Staten Island didn't elect its first African American elected official until 2009. Let me say that again. Till 2009, there had never been an elected official, not that we have discovered so far. And I will always look, but as of now, Debbie Rose was the first African American elected to office, any office, like not even dog catcher, nothing.
Wow.
And so with that, all of the history of who Staten Islanders were and are in terms of being African American had been erased from public viewing. So as the migrants or the refugees, as Brian Stevenson coined the phrase for the Great Migration, as these refugees are fleeing parts south, they're meeting the horrific racism here in the north. They create these sundown towns, and I don't know if you know what sundown towns are, but basically it is, you can work in this community, but you have to be gone by sundown,
right,
or at risk of death.
Yeah.
There's a place in, I believe it's Illinois, it's called Anna, Illinois, and I'm going to be frank in my language because it warrants it. Anna stands for Ain't No Niggas Allowed.
Mm.
And then you go, wow, well, that's the Midwest. But, you know, we talked yesterday to say that in Princess Bay, William T. Davis, as he's writing his map and Yale names and nicknames in that book, there's a place called Niggerhead Rock that is, and he explains that it is just a common place that, you know, most people know as a landmark. But imagine that William T. Davis, the noted historian, is so comfortable knowing that we in Staten Island have a place called that, then that kind of is illustrative of what the refugees were seeing and feeling when they got here during the Great Migration.
Wow, pretty amazing. And so so just a little bit more on sort of the FHA housing projects, and the fact that, you know, because they were government owned and there was no mixed race, population allowed, that originally, the people who originally settled in those were, as you had said before, they were Italian, they were Jewish, who were not considered white either to begin with. Right. And who gradually worked their way into, you know, assimilating into white culture, if you will.
Right.
Which, of course, was nothing that could be afforded to African Americans, right?
Right. Each migrant group who has found disparity tends to have this term, the whitening of.
There you go. Yeah.
You have the whitening of the Italians, the whitening of, and so if and when they blend into the greater society or the greater general community, they are then afforded those things that that privilege provides to any given community. African Americans are still struggling. So while they then find a way into a lot of the public housing is then turned into a derogatory term that it now becomes predominantly Black, and that it then holds a whole host of connotations that go behind that.
Yeah. And Debbie, can you just tell, just sort of to give an anomalous piece to this history, could you tell us about the family around the corner from me here in Castleton Corner on Fairview? It was the Brown family, I believe.
That's right.
And yeah, tell us a little bit about what
so
happened.
Samuel A. Brown was a letter carrier. So he worked for the government. His wife was a school teacher, Catherine Brown, and they were middle class, and they wanted to find a nicer place for their family to live. They had a family of 6. They had 4 children and the 2 parents. There was a racially restrictive covenant that was in place in this community, but the person who they purchased the home from decided to ignore it, and she sold the house to Sam Brown. Sam Brown obtained a mortgage and obtained insurance, rather.
Insurance, yeah.
And in obtaining the insurance, the white developer of the community was angry. They offered him to buy out the house. He said no. They said, we'll pay you $10,000 above what you purchased for the house. And he said, no, I want my family to live here. And so then they got the Klan involved, and the Klan wrote a letter, and they said that they were going to kill his wife on the way home from school, and that the children would see it. They terrorized the family. Finally, he got the NAACP involved. They created a chapter here on Staten Island in 1925, and he sued the developer and the company and the community. Their windows were pelted out, and the windows were busted out, and their lives were threatened. He got a gun. He got a permit to carry a gun. They had the police that were protecting the home. Eventually, they pulled the police. They pulled his permit, and with the NAACP involved, he and his ability to sue them, they then settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money, and he was able to raise his family there. But it was his stick-to-itiveness, tenacity, and just all around, I'm not going.
Can't
make me go.
Yeah, he fought the system and he won.
And with all of that, he was able to stay. But that's 1925.
Yeah.
In 1940, there is a case. I believe her name was Geraldine McDonald. Mrs. McDonald lived in the Sandy Ground, and she worked as a social worker, a social service, and she worked for the city, I believe. And she was on her way to work across New Dorp, where North Railroad is in that area, and it was kind of barren field near Grant City, I think, maybe that general vicinity. And a white man in his early 20s raped her. And she couldn't get any redress here from any of the police officers. And so she contacted the NAACP. And the NAACP got involved. And they then convinced the judges and the prosecutor, rather, to prosecute this man. The newspapers then started to talk about him as they do as a young boy. And as this young boy has mental health challenges. And so they send him to Bellevue for 3 days for, evaluation. On his way out, they're like, oh, great, we're going to prosecute him. And they send him to another mental health facility to help him out. And as they say now, okay, great, he has some issues. We'll let him stay. as he's coming out, the prosecutor then goes after him, and they keep moving him from mental health facility to mental health facility. And he, to this day, I can't find where he actually was prosecuted for the crime of rape, similar to what happened in the South.
Yeah.
And so all of those things, again, I say that we as Staten Island would like to believe that because we're in the North, things are different here, things were different for us. But the exact same crimes against Black bodies that we accuse the South of perpetrating, we were actually perpetrating here on Staten Island as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that really illuminating picture. I mean, I am shocked to learn there's racism going on in Staten Island. Shocked. Okay. And our third moment follows the Kerner Commission report. And this thing is so interesting to me. I found reference to it in an article that appeared in the Arts and Leisure section, as a matter of fact, of the New York Times a couple of Sundays ago. And it was sort of why are we not having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind here? So I pulled out this little piece about the Kerner Commission, and I want to read it because I think it so totally relates to where we are now in this moment. So in 1968, in the wake of the racial conflagrations roiling American cities during the mid and to late 1960s, Governor Otto Kerner Jr. of Illinois presented the findings of his so-called Riot Commission, whose politically moderate and racially uniform makeup, only 2 of its members were Black, only 1 was a woman, surprise, surprise, promised the usual ho-hum results, designed to sink like a stone with little notice. But what it delivered to President Lyndon B. Johnson was instead shockingly, comprehensively grim. The commission concluded that the US is a hopelessly divided nation, that it has assigned its Black citizens to lives of impoverishment, and that good white folks were detached and disinterested and therefore were as culpable as the white supremacists were malignant. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
A little bit.
Yep. The report concluded that, among other things, the violence in the cities was rooted in racial injustice that demanded massive, now get this, that demanded massive housing and police reform. It needed serious political and economic commitment to social programs and to, wait for it, higher taxes. When it was published as a book in early 1968, the report, oddly enough, became a bestseller. So why did nothing meaningful come out of this? The conclusions were too overwhelming. President Johnson seemed to take the findings personally. But then think, 1968. The money required to confront the systemic problems that were holding Black Americans from full participation in American civic life were being massively spent to step up and prolong the war in Vietnam. The report ought to have been followed by a televised, multi-part presentation of the Commission's intensive effort. Its conclusions, considerable fieldwork, and historical contextualizing should have been put before the general public alongside the revelation of the harm to disgruntled, despondent, enraged, and hurt Black Americans whose circumstances swell the report. It should have been televised. Why was the American public not learning? No, sorry. The American public was already learning about the horrors of war on nightly television screens. What better way to inform an ignorant public? And yet at that time, all of the focus was going then to Vietnam, 1968. So here we go. We seem to find ourselves, right, in the very same moment today, just where we were at the conclusion of the Kerner report. It's all there. Doesn't it sound really familiar? So Debbie, Is this the time now for Truth and Reconciliation that we should have had after that Kerner report?
So, you know, I struggle with this one. I'll be honest. Truth and reconciliation often comes when those who have been harmed the most extend an olive branch to make those who have done the harming feel comfortable that they can have a conversation and feel as though no one wants to feel blame, right? So when we talk about slavery and reparations, the initial knee-jerk response to reparations is, I didn't enslave anybody. My people didn't own slaves.
Right.
And you go, well, but everybody was complicit and everybody benefited from it except those who were enslaved. And does it matter if you were, and then I remember we were having a conversation, one of the talks at the church, and a gentleman who seemed to be a new immigrant from Italy was sitting in the front of the church, and his first, I could see him geared up, I could see him building and holding on to this thing. And when I finished talking, he said to me, "Did you know that Black people own slaves?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "But did you know that probably 95% of them owned their family members to keep them safe by law?" We have a person here on Staten Island who purchased her husband in 1829 in Gloucester County, Virginia, and asked to be able to stay there in that community with the people who they knew and loved. And they got the entire planter community, meaning white men, to sign this petition to allow him to stay. And they said no, because it doesn't work with the notion of slavery. So he's got to go. So they come here to Staten Island, they purchase this land, 78 acres of land out in Princess Bay, close to where we have the landmark that William T. Davis talked about.
Right.
And so the notion is always, I didn't own any slaves. I came here. My people didn't come here till the 1890s. My people didn't come here till the 1920s. My people didn't come here till the 1960s.
Right.
But we're all still, well, let me not say all. There are those who still benefit from the enslavement of Black bodies, from the Jim Crow laws of Black bodies, there's one place in upstate New York where they had that mock Senate that they were doing in the community that this person had. His argument for keeping, for not passing this law was that it would ruin the economic stability of his community that was based on corrections, and that it was one of those correctional facilities that was the major employer, and so therefore it would wreck his community's employment. And so these are all the things that we've been going through. Is it time for reconciliation? Of course it is. I also believe that it's time for reparations. I also now I don't know what reparations looks like, and that's why I think we need to study and come up with a viable plan that works for the majority, because nothing's going to work for everybody, but works for the majority of people who were enslaved and their ancestors were enslaved and their ancestors had to go through Jim Crow and their ancestors had to deal with the redlining and their ancestors had to deal with all of these ills that we've been talking about for the last 40, 50 minutes, that it is time that you compensate. And if we talk about uniting people on the basis of income, right? We talk about class. It's really about class and not about race. But this class system or this caste system that we operate under is based and built, race is based and built into it. So how do you, and again, we talked earlier about the inability for those who identified as white earlier to be able to reconcile. These are abolitionists, and we hold up abolitionists as our saviors. But if the abolitionists had a difficult time reconciling, how do we expect those who don't have those ties to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So it has to be done by law. And I'm not sure that I am still willing to soft stroke, to make it easy for, I believe in making it uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't need to attack you with it. My words are such that in telling the truth and explaining the stories that they will cut. And they're meant to cut, but they're meant to cut so that as we bleed, we can heal. But because if we don't do that, we're going to continue around this horseshoe.
Yeah.
We'll start here, we'll talk about wonderfulness, we'll talk about working together. Every time that we get to this point, we're now in the moment that George Floyd's death is galvanizing all people around the world.
That's right.
But Black people have been fighting this fight. They have been in the trenches since forever. And it's only when those who are identified as white step into this frame that we are now holding up these circles as being worthwhile.
Yes.
And I struggle with that.
Yeah. And as we were talking yesterday, Debbie, we were talking about allyship, you know, and how it is so important for those of us who call ourselves white to not do that, to not feel that we are the ones that are advancing this, but that we learn to step back and follow those of African descent who can tell us and teach us how we can support in moving the agenda forward.
Right. There are those of us who have different skill sets. We have different experiences. We have different things that we know. There are those of you who know things that I just don't know. And if I reach out to you and say, hey, I don't know how to organize this, I don't know how to do this, I would love to have you on board with me. Let's do this together. That's not a problem. But when and oftentimes it does, I had one person tell me I wasn't Black enough. And I was like, say what now? Don't say what now? It was the wife of someone who was an immigrant and was pointing the finger at me saying, calling me a sellout. And I was like, say what? Right. So clearly I dismissed her and kept moving. But the problem then becomes that it again sets us up in the us and thems.
Right.
And this is where it's difficult.
Yeah.
I don't know. People have asked me, well, Debbie, what do you want? How do we fix this? And in my opinion, just my own small, humble opinion, if I had to say how to fix this, is that we need to scrap our Constitution and start all over. Because everywhere embedded in that Constitution is the notion of Black bodies being less than. Slavery is embedded in that Constitution. And as it is embedded in it, the only way that slavery ends is by an amendment. And amendments are meant to be overturned. So Black people in this country are the only people who can wake up tomorrow and be re-enslaved by the Constitution simply by having it overturned.
Wow. Whoa.
And then we think about things like, oh, well, they would never do that. Well, you know, they thought they had a really good deal with prohibition, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And they repealed it.
Yep.
So while we are looking at truth and reconciliation and those things, how do you get to that? It's going to have to be a hard, drastic thing. If not, what we're going to have to continue to do is swell in these moments and fix each moment until we can get to that point.
That moment, right. Listen, thank you so much. Before we open it up so that people can ask questions, I think we'll have to set that up. Maybe we'll unmute people. Maybe you can raise your hands. Maybe you can put something in the chat. I noticed, by the way, there's some comments in the chat, which we'll take a look at too. But Debbie, just one last word. Could you please tell us a little bit about the webinar that's going to be happening next week through the Council of State Governments. So
yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up.
We are having, and let me put these in the chat. We are having a few, we're having several, we call them summits. And these are going to be plenaries that on Tuesday, we're having a conversation with Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law, if I can recommend a book that everyone should read to understand how we got here, why we're here in terms of housing, and how the government has criminalized and placed in this lower caste system people of African descent, it is his book. You can, the webinar is free. You can use that link that I just placed there to sign up for it. We're having another webinar that is going to be discussing the movement, this movement that we find ourselves in, but there's going to be somewhat of a focus on Black ethnicity. And so in the midst of that, we have those who identify, because, you know, African Americans, people of African descent are certainly not monolithic. And so you have those who are Caribbean, those who are African from the continent, and those who are African native born to the United States. And all tend to have a different view. There are certain things that have happened that, you know, I know that me being Jamaican, I heard things growing up that were troubling because I knew it to be different because of the friends that I had. And so, although I should be, you know, first generation immigrant, I feel like you know, I am, or I should feel like an immigrant. I feel like I'm a first generation because I came on my 5th birthday and grew up here. So I had this conversation with my aunt yesterday that she's like, well, aren't you happy for Kamala Harris because she's Jamaican? I go, no, I'm happy because, you know, she's a woman of color. Like, but she's Jamaican. I go, yeah, no, I get that. But I see life through a different lens than they do. And I remember in high school that there was the African community that was moving into Park Hill that and they wanted nothing to do with me because they thought that I was native born to the United States. And then they found out, someone happened to tell them that I was Jamaican, and they were like, oh, you're Jamaican, we'll accept you. And I was like, no, like that's not how this thing goes. And so we still fight that fight. There are, the Kennedy government actually set up this rift between Africans and African Americans. And there's a lot of misnomers and things like that that kind of permeate throughout the communities that I think we're going to discuss so that we can find some solution that's equitable for everybody. So I think these are 2 really good conversations to have. I don't have the other link. We're going to, on Friday, we're going to be discussing housing, environment, education, community safety, in an all-day conference from 8 in the morning till 7 p.m. Yes. Say a prayer for me.
Okay, Debbie, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. So yes, I just got a little reminder from Emily that we are now heading into the coffee hour. And so Kathy, how do we want to set this up so that people can ask questions? Because I noticed that there are some comments, of course, in the chat. And would it be best to have somebody put something in the chat, or can you see when somebody raises a hand? How do you want to do it? Wait, you're muted.
I want to stop recording. So I'm going to do that because